things beyond the ones you gave him?
No, he never did, and that was atypical of most of my clients.
So most of your clients would actually initiate a request for briefings, is that correct?
Yes, if they were planning to make a trip overseas, maybe in connection with a trade mission, and they were a little shaky on the economic and political situation in the country at that time, they would on occasion request CIA briefings, and this would be done by analysts from the CIA.
But he never made such a request?
No, he never made such a request.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Excuse me. Senator Specter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dickerson, on the mathematics, you say you briefed him 37 times, 10 to 15 documents at a time, just so the record is complete. Be 37, 370 to 555 documents of
That would be a rough estimate, yes.
of these raw intelligence reports.
That is correct. There would be a rough estimate.
I want to bring this to a conclusion, Mr. Dickerson. I think we've gotten the essential points here, but I want to cover one more comment that Mr. Wong made, and I refer you to 315-04-602-95. Is it accurate quote? Mr. Huang noted that the, and I'm leaving out the country, assessment of significant business relocations in Hong Kong in the run-up to 1997 appears to be more alarmist than he would assess the situation. And then skipping quite a bit of material, Mr. Huang would like to see more reporting on the Hong Kong business climate as 1997 approaches.
Yes, that accurately reflects his comments.
Senator Glenn referred to Mr. Wong's application, and as I've just gotten it and reviewed it, I don't believe there is any reference to the bonus of some $500,000 that Mr. Wong got. There's a comment here. Staff reviewed it more carefully that that bonus was undetermined, and I don't believe that there is any disclosure here about the relationship of the Lippo company with the Chinese partner. Mr. McNair, on these memorandum disseminations, we've talked to some extent about the problem in a disclosure of sources. And I understand your testimony is that it would be entirely possible from these memorandum disseminations to make a determination as to source of some of these matters. Let me ask you this, because this is what we talked about specifically to try to focus on it specifically. On the category of RH, well, why don't you describe what the RH category is?
That's restricted handling, an extremely limited case description.
And without being overly or melodramatic at all, and not to say that there were any in this situation, but what have been the risks which have been run in the past that you have seen in the CIA where sources, informants have been disclosed?
Well, the most drastic result of an unauthorized disclosure would be death of an asset.
Has that happened?
That has happened in the past.
Very often?
I really can't speak to that. It's a frequent occasion.
Frequent occasion has happened.
In the past, over our 50 years.
And that's something obviously you're always concerned about on these highly classified documents.
Absolutely.
Like the memorandum disseminations.
That's why we restrict the dissemination of them, yes.
Well, we have some discussion which will follow as to whether they're restricted sufficiently. And you and I went over 3 of the memorandum disseminations specifically as to high level of sensitivity. Isn't it true that on those memorandum disseminations that the disclosure of those posed a high risk that there would be a determination of who the asset was, who the informant was, who the source was at a very high level.
And unauthorized disclosure of that could result in identification of a source.
So that someone who had access to the mem de sem, as Mr. Wong did, knowing what was in there, that there was a risk of disclosure of a source at the highest level.
Mr. Wong had a clearance and had a need to know, and if anyone were to commit an unauthorized disclosure, it would endanger a source.
If Mr. Wong chose to do so.
Right, sir.
And that source on those three that he had access to involved sources at the highest level.
Extremely sensitive sources.
At the highest level?
I can only describe them as extremely sensitive sources.
That's good enough. Thank you.
Mr. Gallagher, I take it you have a couple of minutes left on your time. Mr. Gallagher, were you familiar really with Mr. Wong's duties there at Commerce?
No, sir. Only in the sense that Mr. Meissner said that he was his Asian specialist.
Okay. So when you say you wouldn't find it unusual for him to visit the Chinese embassy in light of his duties, you really don't know whether that would be unusual or not for his duties.
Well, as the relationship between the two Johns developed, it was obvious that there was a focus on certain countries. One of them was China, and just as I was visiting the Italian embassy when I was on the Italian desk at State, I would expect people who were doing China work to be at the Chinese embassy.
Do you know how many occasions he visited the embassy?
No, sir.
How many contacts he otherwise had with the embassy?
No, sir.
All right. Senator Glenn?
Just one question, and I'll turn it over to Senator Lieberman. To your knowledge, was there ever any time when he divulged any classified information that was not given to people fully cleared to receive it, or misused any of this intelligence information in any way, all three of you?
No.
No, sir.
No, sir.
Thank you. Senator Lieberman.
Thank you, Senator Glenn. Mr. Gallagher, or maybe Mr. McNair, I wanted to ask a baseline question which underlies all of what we've talked about this afternoon. Somebody casually walking into the room might be surprised to hear that the CIA was doing anything at the Department of Commerce, because I would guess that in the general public view, the CIA is involved with Department of State, Department of Defense. I wonder, if I heard you correctly, this relationship goes back to the time when President Bush was director of the CIA and Elliot Richardson was Secretary of Commerce, and has been followed by every administration since. In general terms, obviously appropriate to this public setting, could you describe why the CIA is briefing
Yes,
officials
sir.
at the Department of Commerce?
I'm glad you asked the question. I give a lot of lectures, particularly within the intelligence community, and they ask the same question: what are we doing over the Department of Commerce? It's because the Department of Commerce is a rather unique creature within the U.S. government, or of the U.S. government. I spent 15 years overseas, usually as a commercial attaché, and in the countries I've been in, the kind of work that the Department of Commerce does is shared by as many as 7 ministries in other industrial countries. You have international trade, you have post and telecommunications, science and technology. NOAA has 3/4 of the world's surface with water, so that's environment, fisheries, economics, and tech transfer. So we easily, when you think of it, don't think of it as a Department of Commerce, but think of it as theoretically 7 ministries all dealing with some form of international work. The idea of just having 10 offices from around the intelligence community helping these 7 ministries to better
Right.
understand is then more easily grasped, I hope.
So in general terms, if I understand it, you are briefing the folks at the Department of Commerce about developments around the world in a way that's aimed at helping them do their job.
Yes, sir. We are at the Department of Commerce the same way that the agency is at other places dealing with policymakers. These
Right.
are people who are dealing in international issues.
Right. So that the briefings, again, in general terms, might include economic information about particular countries. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes, sir.
Might include political information that might affect economic developments.
Even more so.
Right. Might it include, and I use the word cautiously, what we might call industrial espionage?
No, sir.
It would not.
No.
Why is that?
Because CIA won't let me get into business. No. None of us...
Did you say that should be one of the elements of campaign finance reform?
No, I apologize. I shouldn't be flip. None of us, we've had discussion, but nobody thinks that's a good idea.
Okay, so you're briefing on
Overall political, economic,
economic.
biographic, high-level policy type things.
And yet, it receives, I mean, presumably, or is it? I mean, it receives secret, top secret classification. Why is it more than, we might read in The Economist or Time or Newsweek or any of the newspapers that have good economic reporters around the world?
Because CIA has the advantage of not only having all the information that Time and Newsweek has, but it can compare it with other sources.
Such as?
Well, the covert sources that CIA uses.
Okay, and you might brief, for instance, at Commerce based on some of those covert sources as well as the open sources?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I appreciate that. It helps me understand it, and I thought it was important to get it on the record. It also may go to the nature of some of the information that was conveyed to Mr. Wong in general terms. The whole question of briefing Mr. Wong has a certain, it's not quite Keystone Cop quality. I don't mean in your briefing of him, but the question of whether he was supposed to be briefed and who gave approval. This would be an interesting one to diagram, because we had Mr. Garton saying this morning that Mr. Wong should only have administrative duties, in which position I presume he would not be briefed. Then I gather Mr. Meisner appealed to Mr. Garton to allow Mr. Wong to have some policy responsibility regarding Taiwan. And then Mr. Meisner, I gather, Mr. Dickerson, asked you, and he was the person that had authority of you, asked you to brief Mr. Wong on all Asian matters. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. He told me that he considered Mr. Wong his Asian specialist, and he thought it would be useful both to himself and to John Wong to be briefed on Asian matters.
Right, so he said his Asian specialist, not his Taiwan specialist.
That's correct.
Okay, and in hindsight, that's probably something that Mr. Garton and Mr. Meisner unfortunately is gone, but there was a break in the chain of command there. Would you say, and I don't know that this really has any consequence, but I want to ask the question, would you say that insofar as you briefed him generally on Asian matters, you were conveying information to him, classified information, that really was not relevant to his role as the Taiwan specialist to Mr. Meisner?
No, I would not say that, sir.
Why not?
I do know that he had a particular interest in some of the projects, energy projects that were being bid on in Taiwan, and that he was in contact with some of the U.S. firms that were bidding on this particular project, this particular nuclear power project.
Right.
I believe he traveled twice to Taiwan, so he had a specific interest in that project.
No, I understand that, but why would it be necessary to brief him more generally on developments throughout Asia if his area of responsibility was simply Taiwan?
I was not aware that his area of
No, I know you were not. What I'm really asking is if you may have inadvertently, not because it was your fault, but because of the miscommunication between Mr. Garton and Mr. Meisner, have briefed Mr. Wong more broadly than simply on matters related to Taiwan, which is what Mr. Garton thought he was supposed to be doing.
I was not aware of that, so I did brief
All
him more
right.
broadly.
Let me ask a final question. Senator Specter raised the question about the sensitive sources, and Mr. McNair, you and Mr. Dickerson, I believe, said that some of the material that Mr. Wong was briefed on came from extremely sensitive sources. And you were asked if those sources were compromised, what might happen. And you said, quite understandably, in the extreme case, that might result in the death of an asset, the death of a source, one of these sensitive sources. Can you tell us, during the time period when Mr. Wong was being briefed by you, Mr. Dickerson, and then within a period of months afterward, did you in fact suffer, obviously I'm not asking for any identification, the loss or compromise of any of the sources of the material that Mr. Dickerson was briefing Mr. Wong about?
That's beyond my ken. And furthermore, I think it's probably an issue that would have to be addressed to other officials of the CIA who would have knowledge of that.
Yeah. Mr. McNair, do you have an answer?
I don't know of any material involved in this that was disclosed in such a manner that it resulted in the death of a source. I would like to add one point to your earlier question. The difference between this information and Time or Newsweek is, Mr. Gallagher refers to it, is that our information is clandestinely collected from it's protected information. People don't want us to get it. And so that's why it becomes sensitive, that's why it becomes classified. And again, I don't know of any information connected with this particular packet that resulted in the death of a source.
Okay, so to the best of your knowledge, based only on what you saw from what was happening to your sources, none of the sources of the material on which Mr. Dickerson was briefing Mr. Wong were compromised, or certainly none of them were killed during that period of time of those briefings or a reasonable period thereafter.
I just don't know outside of my sense from this particular packet of documents.
Right.
I do not know of any incident.
Right. Well, I'd like to leave you just with the request that you take up the question I've asked with your superiors at the agency and respond to us, and it's fine with me if you do in closed session, because I think it is material. It's one kind of proof test here to see whether any of this information was in fact being conveyed. Thank you.
Are we prepared to go into closed session now? It's 4:45.
I think there's a few.
Well, I asked the question. If you want to continue, then that's your right.
I think Mr. Barron just...
Does anyone over here have anything?
Oh, Senator Durbin is here, too.
Senator Durbin next. Senator Durbin.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, if I can try to summarize my own view of where we have come to this point in regard to Mr. Wong, I think there are two concerns and perhaps a third. The first concern is whether or not Mr. Wong played fast and loose in his fundraising activities, especially when it came to raising foreign funds. And the second concern is whether or not he compromised our national security. And I might say, parenthetically, some believe there could be a connection between the two. At least those are the theories that are out for consideration. You are here to at least address your knowledge of the second charge or suspicion as to whether or not he compromised national security at any time, to the best of your knowledge. And it is understood that Mr. Wong at the outset agreed to come and testify under oath here relative to every aspect that we brought up today in terms of national security, and would be subject, of course, to a charge of perjury if he lied to us relative to his securing classified information, what he did with it. I want to ask you open-ended questions, not shepherding you in any direction here, just to get your opinion based on what you knew then and what you know now. Mr. Gallagher, maybe I'll start with you, and maybe Mr. Dickerson can follow. First, is it your opinion that Mr. Wong was properly cleared to learn classified information at the Department of Commerce?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Dickerson, is that your opinion, or do you have an opinion?
And that's my opinion, yes.
Has anything come to light since this controversy has arisen to change your view on that, Mr. Gallagher?
I have seen no evidence to the contrary. No, sir.
Mr. Dickerson?
And similarly, I have seen no evidence. that would indicate that.
Now, the second charge is that Mr. Wong, while at the Department of Commerce, was shown things he should not have seen for any number of reasons. His business connections, his security clearance, whatever. Mr. Gallagher, based on what you knew then, is there any question in your mind as to what you showed Mr. Wong and whether or not what Mr. Dickerson showed Mr. Wong and whether he should have seen it?
In terms of the information that my office controls, we were 100% correct in what we showed him.
Now, with all the information that's come out and all the allegations since, today, do you believe there are things that Mr. Wong should not have seen at the U.S. Department of Commerce?
I think we have to distinguish between the information and allegations. All I have seen is allegations. Until I saw hard evidence of these allegations, and as long as he continued to have both his need to know and his clearance, we would continue to brief him as we had.
Mr. Dickerson, the same questions. Did you feel that that you were showing things? Did you have any suspicion in your mind that Mr. Wong should not have seen while he worked at the Department of Commerce?
No, I had no suspicions whatsoever that what I was showing him was inappropriate for him.
And today, based on allegations and information, do you have a different view?
No, I don't have a different view because I have no personal knowledge that he did anything in an unauthorized manner in the handling of this classified information.
Now, the third allegation appears to be that he may have misused the information which was given to him, may have compromised a source or compromised the information. As you sit there today, Mr. Gallagher, do you have any information to suggest that that is the case?
I have never been presented with any evidence to prove or disprove that allegation.
Mr. Dickerson?
I would echo what Mr. Gallagher has said in that regard.
Now, I assume in your business, when you're sharing delicate and secure and classified information, that there is a counterintelligence aspect to this to determine whether or not the people that you're sharing it with are keeping it to themselves. Is there not, Mr. Gallagher?
Certainly with all intelligence, sir.
Now, in terms of this period of time, some 13 months at the Department of Commerce, was there any evidence that the information that was being shared with Mr. Wong or anyone at the department at that time was being compromised?
I was not presented with any such item of evidence.
Mr. Dickerson?
To the best of my knowledge, no.
Do you have in front of you a document dated September 24th, 1994?
Excuse me. I returned the documents because I've never seen any of those documents. We would never have seen any of those documents. Those are policy documents, and we just wouldn't see them. The last time I saw documents like that was when I was a Foreign Service officer developing it.
Let me ask you this question. There was some question put to you earlier about the propriety of Mr. Wong visiting the Chinese embassy.
Yes, sir.
And as I recall your testimony, you said you didn't see anything particularly improper about it?
To the contrary. I mean, again, when I was the Italian desk officer, I was expected to be at the Italian embassy.
And so, therefore, it wouldn't surprise you if Mr. Wong's taxicab receipts were submitted to the Department of Commerce for reimbursement?
You better do it.
Thank you.
You want to make these documents part of the record? Are these documents that you can make part of the record?
I think I'll get them in through other witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, I just had one last question, if I could, of Mr. Dickerson. The estimate of Senator Specter was that you showed somewhere between 350 to 500 raw documents to Mr. Wong. Is that correct?
That would be a rough estimate.
Did you take every one of those back with you when you were done with the briefing?
I took every one of those back when I completed the briefing.
Thank you.
All right, if there is nothing further, we will excuse these witnesses with our thanks from the public session. But I think we'd best go right away and go ahead and do the private session. We'll adjourn to room 219 of the Hart Building, which is the Senate Intelligence Committee's secured briefing room.
These hearings have been scheduled each Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday through this month. Tomorrow, members will meet for the final day of hearings this week. You can see today's hearing in its entirety tonight at 10 Eastern Time, or once the House adjourns, on our companion networks.